Hey everybody, welcome back to Digital Production. Welcome back to the spring 2018 semester and week 6 in the class. This is a very important moment because guess what? We are shifting gears.
What? Is it live?
It is live, I believe.
Wait, let me see if it's
a live broadcast.
Let me refresh.
From the studio.
Ah, here it is. I want to check in. Gotta check the.
Are you getting the stream? We're hoping
I am getting the stream.
All right.
Oh, some nice catch lights in the eyes. That's good. Okay, let me switch headphones to see if I can hear it on here.
You may notice there are a range of paraphernalia on the table today.
Yeah. It's a little. Let me bring down.
Bring it down a little bit.
Yes. It's a little hot there.
All right.
Okay.
We have a range of lenses. For example, this Canon lens, and we have a Nikon lens and a Tamron lens and a range of cameras as well here because we are shifting gears this week into the visual portion of the class. We've been so focused on audio. Audition, audio
yes,
production.
I've been so focused on audio, I didn't even know what you were saying. Something about lenses?
Lenses, cameras, lights. We have a couple of lights here as well. Flashes, I'm sorry, what am I saying? Lights.
A strobe versus a continuous light source. They're two different things.
Very important point that we will be delving into for sure. So we have a couple of flashes. We have a couple of old school style cameras here too. Like
back when they were something called film, I think.
Yeah. What is that film thing? Well, we talked about that in the class, film versus digital.
Yes.
And little did you know that film would be making an appearance here in the class. In fact, not only do we have this camera, but we have this Pentax camera over here as well. I'm not sure it's quite in the shot, but it is indeed part of our set today.
And there's the great lenses that go with it.
Very fabulous lenses. These lenses are great for demonstration purposes because they're fully manual lenses, meaning that we can demonstrate things like aperture.
You can actually see it
very well. And so we can take this lens. I think you can even see it from all the way back there. Look at that. So that's a wide open lens. And we can change the aperture value there and close that down and open it back up. Ooh, la la.
So changing. It's an actual physical changing the amount of light.
The amount of light. And that is a key theme for us today. It's all about light.
Yes.
And focus and the bare essentials of camera operation. Because we are shifting into photography and photojournalism and then eventually video. And I want to really make it clear, and I hope and believe that you will agree, that much, if not all, of what we talk about today is just as applicable to video as it is photo, with a couple of...
With some differences, slight differences.
Differences. Yes. We could call them perhaps platform-specific nuances.
Yes, yes.
That we'll get into.
So, but there's a lot of, should people be intimidated by all these fancy, and we don't have any mirrorless cameras out, which is a different new technology.
We do not.
Emerging, well, actually, it's not emerging anymore. It's becoming more mainstream. It is mainstream. And I would argue that within 5 years, people will not be using DSLRs anymore. 5 to 10 years.
5 to 10 years. That is a bold prediction. And you think that they'll have migrated to the mirrorless format?
Well, the way the camera market is going is such that, I mean, if you think about it, how many people do you see walking around just walking around your downtown or walking around wherever walking around?
Yeah.
How many DSLRs do you see now?
Well, you don't see that many now that you mention it. And of course, we joke about this sometimes, but everybody has a mirrorless camera in their pocket.
And what would that be?
Well, their phone.
Their phone, yes.
Because, yes,
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
But no, it's just interesting. So considering that you don't see many people with DSLRs at all anymore.
Yeah.
Then essentially the only people that are, so the way the camera market is going, if you read look at the market and read whatever it is, all the different pundits and things like that, and look at the sales, is that the only people that are buying cameras now are advanced hobbyists or professionals.
Buying DSLRs.
Or any kind of camera. Any kind of camera outside their cell phone. Because if you think about it, if that's not your field or if that's not your profession, why would you buy a camera?
Why would you? I mean, your phone is Wi-Fi enabled, and it has pretty darn good quality.
Well,
it's ultra portable.
I mean, and some of the new phones that are coming out have some pretty incredible technology built into their cameras.
Simulated lighting scenarios.
Simulated bokeh, 4K video. I mean, so why would you? The only people that are professionals who need specific cameras.
And where does that need emerge from? I mean, these phone cameras are really nice.
Well, yes, they're really nice, but if you're a sports guy, if you're a sports guy, you need certain telephoto lenses. And at the current stage, the only way to get those telephoto lenses is actually with long lenses. So, so if you pick up that 70 to 200 millimeter there, right, that is actually a mid-range telephoto. Mid-range professional telephoto lens. And you can see it's fairly large.
Now, just to break down a few concepts here, because terminology will be new to some of our students. We talk about lenses in a couple of different ways, but one of the key ways that we talk about a lens is in terms of its focal length.
Yes.
And this particular lens has a range of focal lengths that it's always measured in millimeters.
Yes.
So this one goes from 70 to 200.
So that would be the angle of view.
And that essentially means that I can rotate this fellow here and change the focal length. Now, what is actually changing? This is very interesting.
Well, you're changing the angle of view, essentially.
Well, changing the angle of view, but what does it really mean?
Well, you're magnifying.
Magnifying, okay.
Or you're showing, by magnifying, you're basically showing, showing less of something, zooming in on a particular area.
Yeah.
And you're showing less as opposed to wide angle, you're showing more. Which is essentially just the angle of view being the angle being what we can see.
So the smaller the focal length number, the wider
the angle
of view.
Yes, yes.
But mechanically, what's going on here? Because this is very interesting. Now, there are. We should back up and say there are two basic kinds of lenses, right? There are prime lenses, fixed focal length lenses.
So the prime lens would be.
So this, for example, is a prime.
Sorry for the. I need to.
You have a device there.
I have a device. Speaking of devices, which I did not turn off, so let me silence that. So that's there we are. See, just too many devices. Too many devices. So yes, prime lens versus zoom lens.
So here's another one. So here, for example, we have a 50 millimeter prime lens. The focal length cannot be changed on this lens. Here we have a variable focal length lens, also called a zoom lens.
So with the prime lens, if you wanted to change the focal length, you basically walk forward or walk back to a certain extent. Well, not really. Well, it's more complicated than that, but.
Well, if you wanted to zoom in, you would have to walk forward or back. In other words, if you wanted to get closer to your subject, you can't do it just using the lens.
Right.
There are a couple of things we want to unravel here, though. Now, but what I find curious is just from a mechanical point of view, it makes sense that this is a fixed lens. It's a prime lens, and it only has one focal length, and so the lens does not expand or contract in any way. Let's take this Canon lens that we have here. And if we unlock this lens, this is also a zoom lens, and it goes from 18 to 200. And here, we actually get this kind of
longer
expansion. Now,
because the distance is actually increasing from the focal plane or nodule, whatever it is, from the lens.
So this number is a real world, meaningful, physical measurement of something.
Yes.
This focal length. But again, if we come back to this lens, I can't help but note that as we go from 70 to 200, which is a large difference, The physical length of the lens does not change.
Yes. Well, that's because that's a professional lens. The other one is a consumer lens, and that is a professional lens. And professional lenses have more lens elements which prevent that from happening.
Now, the way that I understand it to be, and I'm not sure the information you've come across, but my understanding is that the precise definition of the focal length is it's the distance from the sensor in the camera to the middle of the lens as an entire entity. And so I believe what's happening as this is turning is that there is actually a physical part of the lens that's moving inside, that's shifting further or closer to the sensor.
Okay, so just having one nice thing about having all these devices is that I was able to quickly look up the exact definition of focal length.
Thank goodness.
There's a few definitions. The distance between the center of a lens or curved mirror and its focus.
Which, in the context of a camera, I believe would be the sensor.
Yes, would be the sensor. Yes.
Which is in the case of digital cameras, it's the electronic component built into the body of the camera that actually captures the image.
But that's why a telephoto lens is longer, quite literally longer, than a wide-angle lens. And that's why if you have a 400 millimeter or a 500 millimeter, or let's say an 800 millimeter lens, and you're doing sports, and you have to zoom in on some person all the way across the field, then you need that length. So you can't do that with cell phones quite yet.
No, not at all.
But they are working on technologies that actually have multiple lenses built into a phone-looking device, actually. Which
so like
will,
a wide lens and a telephoto lens.
Yeah, which will
like
basically, at some point, you'll just have all these lenses, and you would just, in post, be able to zoom in and zoom out and change your perspective and your focal length and all kinds of things, your focus and everything like that.
Now, one more issue I want to get to before we talk about exposure, another core component of camera technology, is that when we talk about focal length, yes, one issue is how zoomed in we are on the subject. And a telephoto lens like this guy here allows us to get in really close to something really far away. But there's another factor to consider when it comes to differences in focal length. And that has to do with the way that the various shapes within the image are either distorted in one way or another, or exactly the way we would see them with our eyes. Now, what I mean by that is there's a particular focal length that's considered normal, or just sort of the standard focal length, in that it most closely mimics what we see with our eyes.
Yes.
And that is on a
and in fact, there are three of them.
Camera.
There's three of them. So the Nikon D810 has the Nikon 50 millimeter. The Canon has the Canon 50 millimeter, which is the one behind your computer, right directly behind. No, right behind, right? No,
right here.
Right? No, no,
right,
no, right? No, no.
Oh, right here.
There, right there.
There it is.
Yes, that is the Canon 50 millimeter, and then actually there's the old manual focus
and then this
50 millimeter. Yeah. So we have three 50 millimeter.
Three different 50 millimeter.
Yes, and
lenses.
actually, so we have a full frame sensor, and then there's an APS-C sensor, which again, somewhat, not that it's hard, but it does change some things around slightly.
It does indeed. Now, very important when we're thinking about focal lengths of lenses, actually, because when we say that 50 millimeters is standard or a gold standard, that's in reference to a full frame camera.
Full frame, yes. So what's interesting is that a 50 millimeter does not, the lens is still a 50 millimeter, the lens itself is still a 50 millimeter lens, but what happens is if you have a smaller sensor, then the equivalent, certain things are cropped. You're cropping in a way.
Yeah.
So you're zooming in, so you're basically converting that lens, not the lens, but the equivalent somewhat focal length.
A lot of photography,
50 to 85, and that's getting somewhat convoluted.
A little bit, but a lot of photography boils down to ratios.
Oh, yes,
of various kinds.
Yes.
You really can't say a lot if you just have one number or one value. You need to know what that number or value is relative to something else that's happening. And in this particular case, focal length and sensor size go hand in hand. And this comes about in different ways. So mirrorless cameras. There are different formats, but
so you have the Micro Four Thirds
Micro
system,
Four Thirds is
yours.
one of the most popular ones, and that's the camera I have.
Right. Basically Sony and Panasonic are the two biggest, and Fuji actually. Fuji.
Olympus as well.
Yeah, Olympus, yeah.
But for the Micro Four Thirds format, I think Panasonic is really maybe the front runner now. Some may argue that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's between Sony and Panasonic and Fuji. I think those are the big three. I think those are the ones that are competing with each other because they each have their pros, which makes it very, very difficult when you want to start investing in a new system, which is what I would like to do.
Well, and Sony
what do you do?
Also provides the full frame mirrorless cameras.
Right.
But,
and it gets very, yes.
So many things to figure. But if you have a Micro Four Thirds mirrorless camera, your sensor size is half of the size of a full frame sensor.
And it's even smaller than an APS-C sensor, which is in that Canon 7D.
Yeah. So what that all means in the end, since the sensor size is half, a focal length of 25 millimeters on a Micro Four Thirds camera is equivalent to 50 millimeters on a full frame camera, is equivalent to about 40 millimeters on a crop sensor, an APS-C crop sensor.
Yes.
Give or take.
Yes.
Now, everything gets a little fuzzy. So if you buy a standard lens on, say, a Canon or Nikon, it's 50 millimeters. It's not 40-something millimeters.
Right. The lens itself doesn't change. It's the equivalence depending on what sensor you have in the camera.
Yeah. So, but anyway, the thing that to bear in mind here also is, so 50 millimeters in the full frame format is considered very close to human vision. And human vision sees the world, we see the world a certain way, and we see objects in proportion to each other a certain way. As you go lower than 50 millimeters, as you go wide, and you have like a 28 millimeter lens, the difference between objects and their size becomes exaggerated.
Well, because you're literally seeing more.
So you're kind of cramming more into the same space. And to do that, there's distortion that has to happen. And when you go closer than 50 millimeters, if you go long and you have a 200 millimeter, the difference between the sizes of objects shrinks to less than what's normal, given our vision.
And and so, but what's interesting is that the distance plays a huge factor in that.
Distance between
so if you have a wide angle lens,
if you get
like there's a wide angle lens right on the Canon on the Nikon D7000 to your right over
right here.
That right that one that is that's a wide angle, and that actually is a wide angle specifically for crop sensor. So if you look through that,
all the way down to 10 millimeters.
10 millimeters. So you can see that it's like if you look through it, it's a huge.
Yeah.
It definitely, you can get really, really close to something.
Let's take a little look here. See what we have. Oh, yeah, look at that.
So you can get right up close, and then you're like.
Super, super close.
So now if you get super close to someone and like you focus on their nose, then their nose may look really, really big if you get really, really close. But if you're far away and you use that lens and they're in the center, then they will appear normal.
So this effect is exaggerated the closer we get to the subject.
Yes.
This distortion effect.
So I wonder if it's already 5:36. I wonder if people are utterly confused now.
We haven't even talked about. We may have done it.
We haven't even talked about.
I don't think we even intended to begin with focal length. But
no, it just morphed into that because they're probably wondering what are all these things. So should we talk about exposure?
Let's talk about exposure. And rest assured, we'll come back to these concepts. We're just introducing them right now. But focal length, let's just put that aside for a moment. Let's talk about exposure, which I believe may be a personal favorite topic of yours?
Well, it is a very interesting topic. Yes, yes. And I know people struggle with it in the beginning.
And why do you think that is?
I do not know.
What is exposure?
Well, I mean, ultimately, it could be how much light hits the sensor. That could be one definition. I think that's probably the amount of light that hits the sensor to produce the image.
Mm-hmm.
And exposure is well, so, and essentially yes. So,
but let's say that I'm new to all this.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to make it simple.
And it seems to me that light is good. We want light.
Yes, it's all about light.
Isn't it the case that the more light that hits the sensor, the better?
Well, no, that's the thing. Okay, yeah. See, so that's the thing. Part of exposure is controlling. Well, there is the exposure, but controlling part of determining how much light is hitting the sensor is controlling the amount of light, controlling the light, controlling the amount of light that hits the sensor, and you can do that with two different ways physically, and then another way is done with an amplification from the sensor digitally.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you can have too much light, and you can have too little light.
Yeah, so
exposure is all about managing the amount of light.
Yes, that's a good way of managing the amount of light to produce an image, a digital image. So it's like our eyes. People always use the eye analogy.
Okay.
Right. So when you you're outside, you're in a movie theater. It's dark. Right. So your pupils expand to let in a lot of light. And then when you go outside and it's really bright outside, you go, oh, it hurts. So what happens is, your eyes have to adapt. So the pupils close down and there's let in less light. And so, I mean, that's essentially, people use that analogy a lot.
So our pupils contract and dilate?
Yes, so light is being controlled. The amount of light is being controlled.
And our eyes, and I guess in tandem our brains, are essentially trying to achieve a normal level of light.
Right, yes.
If we're in a dark area, we're trying to bring in more light so that we can see.
Yes.
And another way of thinking of that is so we can see more detail around us, and it's not just shrouded in shadow.
So the brain is like the sensor.
The brain is like the sensor, the eyes are like the lens.
Yes.
And the pupil is like what? Exactly?
Like the f-stop or iris.
The iris.
Or iris in video terms, and then f-stop and, or the aperture, f-stop, aperture for both.
So when we get to one of these old school style lenses and we're looking straight through the lens there and we rotate this guy, what we're changing is akin to the pupil of the eye, but it's the aperture of the lens. And that is directly affecting how much light passes through the lens and into the sensor.
Right.
So we can have this wide open.
So if that's wide open, then a certain amount of light, a certain volume of light amount is coming through the lens.
And if we go way, way down, we have just a little pinprick hole in the middle.
Then the amount of light that's going through the lens is being reduced.
Reduced drastically.
Drastically,
in fact.
Yes.
If we were monitoring these changes on a camera, from this particular lens, I can go from 16. That's the smallest possible opening that I can create is an f value of 16.
Yes.
And this gets a little confusing because it's based off of a ratio.
Which is a ratio. It's actually 1 over 16.
1/16.
1/16.
That's a more natural way to think of it, because 1/16 of possible light, let's say, is coming through the lens. And as I get closer to 1, I can't get all the way there on this lens, but I can get to 1.4. That opens all the way up there.
And you can see that's a pretty big hole.
Pretty big.
So lots of light is being let in. And because it's a ratio, it's counterintuitive, but it's really because it's just really a ratio. 1/1/16 is smaller than 1/1.4 or 1/2. So it really does make sense if you think of it as a ratio as opposed to just the actual number.
And there's another reason why it's so important to think of it as a ratio, because, so let's say your F value is 2, but it's a ratio, so it's actually 1/2 or 1/2. And then you change it to 4, and now it's 1/4 or 1/4. Well, those changes, those differences from 2 to 4 are way, way more significant than going from, say, 12 to 16.
Well, you're doubling or halving the amount of light
16.
with every stop.
With every stop, yeah.
Yes.
So it's an exponential change that you're making, if I'm not mistaken.
Actually, I'm not sure. I don't think it is exponential.
But it's not linear. Would it be linear?
I think it may actually. Well, it's
My
not like.
goodness.
Oh my gosh.
Well, let's think about this a second.
Well, but essentially, okay, this will be something that is essentially you're doubling or halving the amount of light.
Well,
and I think
this is
that
a good
would be
fact check for our.
I think that may be
students.
well, that would be linear then, right? As opposed to being exponential, or
Well, see, my way of
or
understanding
logarithmic.
linear, and maybe it's a completely different scale that we haven't considered yet, but to me, linear would mean every time you bring the value up or down, you're changing the amount of light by the same amount.
well, right. So 1/2 to 1/4, 1/4 to 1/8.
Well, okay, but yes, but you're jumping ahead there when you do that, right?
Well,
Because, well, okay, so on this lens,
well, the key. I think the key. This is becoming. Some people. It's.
We're getting
I don't want.
bogged
I don't want people to think that this is all math. This is all about. And they have to understand all this. Like, was it exponential or linear or what the hell are they saying? That the key thing is that you're either doubling or having the amount. You're less light or more light is the lens is allowing less light or more light.
yes.
That's the key
This
thing.
is the key point.
It doesn't,
we can control
because
the amount
it's-
of light, can and should, and need to, by changing this
Right.
value. And it's a ratio, and the larger the number, the smaller the opening, and the less light. that
So you
comes
don't
in.
need to be a mathematician. You have to be. You can't be afraid of technology, but it doesn't mean you have to be an engineer at the same time.
That is a very important statement. There is a secondary effect that happens when you change your F value, and particularly when you go from really wide open to really closed down. And again, to use the eye analogy, if you're really trying to see something clearly, sometimes you kind of squint, right?
Yes.
Like you
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
close things down
Yeah.
and you look very carefully. That's sort of what happens when you go to these higher f-stop values.
Right. When you squint,
Yeah, yeah. you squint, so it's like an F-16,
oh, like the fighter plane.
like the fighter plane. Yes.
It's really fast.
Whereas if your eyes are just wide open, maybe it's a little harder to focus,
Or eyes wide shut.
or eyes wide shut.
For the little
Prefer
Stanley
that.
Kubrick movie reference there.
Yes.
For those who are Stanley Kubrick fans.
Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman.
Yes.
Well, anyway, with the as the lens opens up wider, very important concept, which is the depth of field,
Yes.
changes. And the depth of field is the amount of the shot that is in focus. And if you have a very deep
Yes.
depth of field
In relation to the subject, either behind or in front of the subject.
in relation to the subject, yes, how much space in front of and behind the subject remains in focus. That's the depth of field. If the depth of field is very deep, you could go a good distance from the subject in either direction, and the subject remains in focus.
And interestingly enough, I learned that our eyes work that same way. Like we think that we see everything in focus, but we really don't.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So if you put your, well, then actually there's another thing. If you look at something closer, then you see that actually everything becomes double behind. But supposedly there is a certain amount of not everything is perfectly in focus with our eyes.
So
we're not aware of it.
And I don't know if it's been calculated, but there's some equivalent f-stop value for our eyes, perhaps.
It's whatever it is, but we're not really aware of it consciously.
Yeah. Yeah, and then along those lines also, we can see a very narrow range very well.
Yes.
At what we might consider a high resolution, and then we have peripheral vision that really kind of drops down significantly.
Right, which is actually quite low.
Scanning and changing.
Yes, which is actually quite low resolution.
Yeah. So anyway, the human eye and the brain is just a fascinating thing. But the point with using our aperture to change the amount of light coming in is when we go wide open, the depth of field becomes shallow. Sometimes it becomes very, very shallow. If you go down to 1.4, for example, that's a very shallow depth of field, to the point where a subject's nose may be in focus, but not their ears.
Right, and you can calculate that using depth of field converters, and so
there are apps you can get for your phone.
Yes, you can do apps. You can easily just do it. It's very, very easy to do. When would you want to use a shallow depth of field?
Well, a shallow depth of field can be very helpful when you want to draw the viewer's attention to the subject, whatever that subject may be. If you want to really capture a specific person, a facial expression, an object, and you want to decrease the complexity of the shot and get the background and other superfluous objects essentially out of the shot. They're still there, but they're out of focus, and so the viewer's attention is on a specific thing that remains in focus.
Which is very important, because our eyes, we don't like to look at blurry things, so we automatically are attracted to areas that are in focus.
Right.
Whether we like it or not.
Simplifying our shots is actually a really great technique, especially early on, to achieve better photography and video. And a shallow depth of field is one of the techniques we can use for simplification, because it eliminates a lot of factors from our shots, particularly at really shallow depth of fields.
But it does make things like focus extremely important, and
very
other
important
issues.
Point, yeah. The more shallow the depth of field, which is achieved through that lower F value, the more pressure we have to get it right. Because if we're a little bit off and our subject is out of that range of focus, it's going to be very apparent to our viewers. And professional quality work, with very rare exception, is always in perfect focus.
So, and like with your Panasonic, you have you just got some new lenses, and they're pretty shallow.
They are. These lenses go all the way down to 0.95.
That's pretty shallow. That's pretty shallow.
That's very shallow.
Yeah.
Now, it gets tricky because it's the micro four thirds format.
Yeah, so then you got to consider the equivalent f-stop also. So it's not truly 0.95.
But they do let in a tremendous amount of light, which is great because for smaller sensors, light is a concern, getting enough light.
So when you want to get critical focus with your system, you also have a monitor.
Yes.
If I understand it correctly.
An external monitor, so I can see better what's happening. And that monitor has a feature called focus peaking, which is a visual clue as to what part of the shot is in focus. And this is something that mirrorless cameras in general actually do very well. Even the entry-level mirrorless cameras provide that feature, which is common on video cameras, but at least prosumer-level video cameras, but not DSLRs.
Right, which is why mirrorless technology now has gotten to the point where it's very compelling because it's very usable.
Yeah.
In the past, it was not terribly usable. But now, with the new mirrorless systems, they can do so much more than a DSLR for the same amount of money.
Right.
That it's almost like, why would you get a DSLR?
And particularly if you're interested in video, I would say.
Yes, actually, yes. That is disclaimer. Yes. If you're strictly into photography, if all you ever want to do is photography and you never ever want to do video, then and let's say you're doing landscapes,
Yep.
then DSLRs, medium format, even film is completely fine, right? Because you're not trying to track anything.
Right.
You don't have to worry about focus peaking and all this other kind of stuff.
Right.
You can just take your time and set it up and do that.
Yeah. So the thing about it is DSLR cameras were and are built with photography in mind. Video is kind of a byproduct or a side effect. And mirrorless cameras, it's kind of the opposite. They're built with video in mind. And oh, by the way, you can also shoot photos.
And actually, yes. In fact, some of the, like Panasonic just came out with their G9, which is their photo-specific mirrorless camera. So they have a camera now for photography, and they have a camera, and they have a few cameras now for video. The G5, the GH5, and the GH5S.
Now, just a quick sidebar. We keep talking about mirrorless cameras. Now, that's in contrast to SLR cameras, predating digital, and of course DSLR, digital SLR cameras, which have a mirror, which we can actually, I think, kind of see here.
Yes, and the great thing is, with this is you can touch it and break it. You can touch it, not break. You
I can touch, and I don't have to buy it.
You can touch it, and because it's impossible to break. Because if you take
Very
the
good build
photo,
quality.
right, the mirror flips up, and you can see that in the back there's the film. That's where the film would be.
Back there. So that mirror is reflecting the image into the optical viewfinder so that you can look through it and see what's happening in the world. And you're actually seeing a reflected image bouncing off that mirror. Meaning that mirrorless cameras do not have an optical viewfinder because they have no mirror.
They have an electronic viewfinder.
They have an electronic viewfinder or an EVF, which is a simulated version of an optical viewfinder.
It's basically it's the same kind of viewfinder you would see on a traditional video camera.
Yep.
And in the past, the EVFs were not that great, honestly, but the new EVFs that are coming out with the new mirrorless cameras are pretty incredible. And having used both, I just don't, I really, I don't know. It's becoming difficult. So the shutter speed.
Shutter speed, yes. So was there anything else on? So we talked about focus, very important. Oh, I just wanted to mention so many of the things we're talking about here. I'm sorry?
What? Depth of field?
Depth of field, yeah. So we talked about depth of field.
Yes.
I just want to mention that there is a technical and an artistic aspect to everything we're talking about.
Yes.
There is a lot of science behind how this stuff works. Clearly, we stumbled a little bit through that part of the presentation, but it's there. And there's a technical aspect to mechanically changing these settings using our gear. But in the end, we just have to figure that out so that we have artistic control over our photos and our videos, and ultimately journalistic control, depending on the context that we're producing in. Depth of field is not a technical issue in the end, in my mind. It's an artistic and possibly even a journalistic issue.
It's lenses have a certain depth of field, but that is artistically used artistically.
And the same could be said with focal length.
The same with focal length, the same with shutter speed, the same with ISO. They all produce a certain, one could dial in values for certain exposure combinations, which will produce certain depths of field and everything like that. But they're used to produce, they're used artistically. In the sense that, and this is the one thing that I think that, we haven't talked about shutter speed, so I probably shouldn't say anything yet.
Well, why don't we talk about shutter speed?
So
that's an important part of, there's a triangle, and it is called the exposure triangle, and it has 3 corners, and we've talked about one so far, which is the aperture.
So there's another physical way to control the amount of light that it's a sensor, and actually, you can if you use the old manual cameras, they can actually hear it.
Yeah, because a guy like this, we can actually use this knob here to change the. How does this? I don't know.
Well, it's not the Pentax. You have to use the other one.
The other one.
That's not the. Is that the Pentax?
No.
Okay, yeah,
it's
that
not the
one.
Pentax.
So you just turn the little knob doohickey thing on the top to
Yep.
the shutter speed, and then you just press the button
All right.
to shutter, and then you just turn the little dot. You know,
All right. So this is a. Let's go to. All right. This is 1,000.
1,000.
All right.
So what? Okay. So what is that? 1,000. That sounded fairly fast.
Let's hear it one more time. All right.
So how about what if you turn it to 1? Huh. That sounded a little longer.
It almost sounded like it was 1 second.
1 second. 1/1000. I would say so.
So shutter speed is measured in seconds, and 1 is 1 second, and 1,000 is 1,000th of a
So
second.
fractions of a second.
Fractions of a
So
second.
again, we have the ratios.
There they come again. Those ratios.
So one may think, well, we have 1 and then 1,000. So why is 1,000? If 1,000 is bigger, why is it faster?
Right.
Well, it's because it's a ratio, because it's a fraction of a second. It's
Yeah.
1/1000th of a second.
Exactly. And 1 second is 1/1, a whole second. And this is the amount of time
But the shutter is open.
the shutter is open. The shutter is the protective barrier between the sensor and the world.
Yes.
Like
Or
doors that open and close.
right, and literally it just it's a physical device that literally opens and closes.
As far as still photography is concerned, at least.
Yes,
Now,
yes.
for video, there is the concept of an electronic shutter. So the physical shutter actually does stay open the whole time when we're shooting video, but it's the same principle that light is being allowed to impact the sensor for a finite amount of time. The more time that light is hitting the sensor and the sensor is absorbing that light, the more light is recorded.
So then there would be a reciprocal relationship, correct, between shutter speed
one
and
hand.
f-stop.
And f-stop on the other hand.
So if you have a big hole or a large f-stop, then that's letting in lots of light. So if you wanted to, so then you would most likely have a fast shutter speed
to balance things
to balance.
out, in other words.
Yes.
Because now it does depend on the amount of light in the environment, but all things being equal, if we're allowing a lot of light through one of these factors, our aperture, for example, that means we need to clamp down on the amount of light using another factor.
Because the image may
Shutter
be overexposed.
Maybe very overexposed, yeah.
Because that's too much light.
Yep. On the other hand, if we, for whatever reason, want or need a small opening, so we have an f of 12 maybe, or even 16.
Because we're doing a landscape photo, and we want to have the deepest depth of
We
field.
want everything in focus.
Everything in focus.
Well, we're going to have to compensate because we're not allowing a lot of light in, and so we need to slow down that shutter speed to allow more light.
So
to come in.
the shutter speed would be open for a longer amount of time.
Yeah.
So enough light would hit the sensor.
I don't know that there is a analogy in terms of how the human eye works or the brain. I don't think we have
I don't
a
think there
shutter
is.
speed per
No.
se.
No, I don't think there is.
It's just continuous.
Unless there's any ophthalmologists who are listening who may know of a
They
shutter
may be able
speed.
to provide some
If there are
insight.
any ophthalmologists listening and you know of a shutter speed equivalent in the eye, please tell us, because I'm kind of curious myself.
We'd love to
too, because for teaching purposes, it's always like, how do you explain the shutter speed in relationship with the eye?
Right.
You just don't know.
We're always a little stuck on
It's
that.
always a little, yes, exactly.
But we do know that the shutter speed, along with the aperture, also has a secondary effect.
Yes.
It changes something about the quality of the image that we capture. And this is true whether we're shooting video or still photography.
So, something about motion.
Something about
If
motion.
I understand.
Yeah, yeah. And I think this will be a reasonable concept for our students here, because it makes sense that if you're allowing your shutter to be open for a full second, you're no longer recording just a split second in time. You're recording a whole second in time. So all of that data gets recorded.
In other words, if the shutter speed is open for a second and someone is moving around a lot in front of the camera, then all that motion will be recorded.
All of that motion will be recorded, yes. Because it's no longer truly a single moment in time. It's a second, and a lot can happen.
Isn't that a song? One Moment in Time by Cyndi Lauper, I think.
Well, maybe.
One moment. I don't know.
I don't know.
I was distracted by the...
But I can go from here to here in a second. From here, I could probably go from here to here in a second.
So, how would that motion be recorded in the photo?
Every moment along the way would get captured. And so what you'd end up with is a blur of my hand in all positions along the way.
So kind of like a ghost?
Kind of like a ghost, yeah. It would be very blurry, and you would see an arc, basically, that I could make with my hand.
So
if that shutter was open for that full second.
What if the camera was moving also?
An excellent question, because this motion would also be captured.
So then everything would be blurry.
Everything would be blurry because the entire camera would be moving through space. And so you would end up with, in almost every case, a really unfortunate image.
Unless one was being completely artistic and doing it as like fine art or something like that.
In which case you just have to go hog wild and really go for it.
Yes.
But in all other cases, we have to be very careful about camera movement when it comes to slow shutter speed photography and videography to a lesser extent.
Is that, yes. That would not be acceptable for National Geographic or any other newspaper.
No.
Or any graded assignment, I would assume.
I would believe that is a fair assumption.
I would think
so. And it comes back to this reciprocal relationship, right? So, all right, you're telling me I can't have my shutter speed so slow. Okay, so maybe I need to open up my aperture to let more light in, and then I can speeden up. Quicken up.
Speeden up.
I can hasten along my shutter speed.
Oh my, the thing just went off. Oh,
it's back. That was,
I think
my heart skipped a beat there.
I think the HDMI cable is going bad.
Seen better days.
Yes.
All right, well, we've talked about two factors. Well, okay.
Okay, so these are these two. So these are two actual physical mechanisms in the camera to control the amount of light that hits the sensor.
Yes, time and size.
Right. So then there's a third
like
one.
Time and space. It's all of.
There's a third one which is of a digital nature. And what would that be?
And this is our ISO or ISO value.
ISO.
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 Do people say ISO or ISO? I feel like it's sort of like GIF and GIF. You hear both.
GIF and GIF.
Caribbean,
exactly.
Caribbean.
Or tomato, potato. Privacy.
Yes. What side of the pond are we on here?
Well, if you're privacy, would be in England. Correct. Privacy.
So ISO or ISO doesn't really stand for anything meaningful. But the point here is that we can digitally, through the use of some software, control how much light is captured.
So we can digitally amplify the signal.
Yeah.
The output of the sensor.
Making the sensor more sensitive to light, all other things being equal. And so that's great because ISO, when all else fails, gives us a way of balancing the equation. Because sometimes we're trying to achieve balance with just our shutter speed and our aperture, and we can't quite get it. And so with our ISO, we can level everything
because
out.
There may not be enough light, and this is something that people, a lot of times when people are first learning this, they don't. I think that's something that really trips them up.
Yeah.
They're like, why can I not? Why is the photo underexposed?
Yeah.
Why is it underexposed? Why is the camera not allowing it? Why?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's because there's not enough light.
Right.
For the sensor.
Right.
Because people think Well, I can see it fine, so why can't the camera see it fine?
And the truth is that our eyes, as I understand it, in general, are fairly sensitive to differences in light.
Yes.
And we are able to see in the dark, well, we can't see in the dark, but we can see in low light situations fairly well once our eyes have adjusted.
Right, because we supposedly in low light conditions we can't see color very well, but we can see tonal variations better because, and that makes sense, I guess, is that for survival purposes you want to be able to see tonal variation, and color really doesn't matter that much.
As long as you can detect the outline of the bear about to hurl itself
or the
at
lion,
you, you're
or,
okay.
Or the tiger.
Or the tiger, yes.
Oh my.
So we control our ISO, and
I wonder if anyone got that one.
Wizard of Oz, right?
Well, yeah, but I wonder if anyone got it.
Oh, whoops! I should
have said it.
Yeah, well.
So, okay, so if there's not, you have your shutter speed and f-stop, and it's dark, a dark situation.
Yeah.
And you don't have any extra light, you can't add light, then you could increase the ISO.
You could do so. And on some cameras, you can increase it quite a bit.
Oh, actually into the millions now. It's unusable, but it's in the millions.
Normal values that you might find on an entry-level DSLR would range from 200 to maybe 6,400 ISO values.
Yeah, and the more advanced ones can go up to 51,000 now without a huge amount of noise. So exactly what is the byproduct of increasing the ISO?
Well, you do get this unwelcome side effect, which is digital noise.
And that is actually the artifact from the amplification of the signal. Just like if you amplify the gain on a mixer or something like that too much, then you get all that it amplifies that background noise that you hear. So that's essentially the same thing that's happening.
And in large part because we're dealing with a similar problem. There's just not enough. There's not enough light.
Right.
And so we're trying to boost what little light we have, or there's not enough sound, so we try to boost it up.
Right.
And in the process, there's always the junk that we don't want that gets boosted as well.
Because we don't want the junk.
We don't want the junk. I think I was mentioning to you, I had a strange experience. Well, not strange, but I was watching this excellent film, Phantom Thread.
Oh, yes.
I highly recommend it.
It supposedly got nominated for Best Picture.
I'm not surprised. It's an excellent movie.
Although I was talking to Ralph, my father, and he did not like it.
Really?
He said the story was didn't make any sense. He said it was the cinematography was beautiful and everything like that. But he said in his view, the acting was a little flamboyant.
Okay.
Just not just flamboyant in the sense of like Daniel Day-Lewis being like, I'm acting kind of thing. I don't know if that's...
Well, I don't know. He did apprentice with a tailor for a year, apparently, before shooting it. But.
Well, Daniel Day-Lewis is dedicated to his craft. He is an excellent actor, He's truly dedicated.
But the thing that really jumped out at me in watching this is I was telling you, there were a few shots, and the noise on these shots was so apparent. And I just couldn't understand it because...
And you said it was very abrupt.
Yes, all in the same scene. So, your typical scene, you're cutting between different shots, different camera angles. And so there was a scene inside. It was a dark scene. I will definitely say that. It was a low light situation. But it was a scene where there maybe were 5 or 6 different shots that were cutting between. And 5 of the 6 were fine. And the 6th one was very, very noisy. And they came back to it 2 or 3 times. And I just couldn't understand why they even
And you don't
did
think it was done for artistic purposes?
I don't think so, because all the other shots were fine.
Which, that's...
But I just didn't understand. But anyway, I digress. But
so
be aware, because you'll see this noise, and we see it in some of our students' work.
Oh, yes.
There's a lot of
I
noise.
think that's one of the most common mistakes. Things that people make is that when they're first learning, is they crank up the ISO too high when it should not. I mean, the ISO should always be at the lowest possible value to have the least amount of digital noise.
A step of last resort.
Yes, a step of last resort.
We use the ISO to boost the light if we have no other options.
Yes.
Including getting more light physically into the space.
Yes, that's why in movie sets, or even in this modest production that we're doing right now, we have there's lights all the wazoo.
Lights everywhere.
Very carefully placed. And on real movie sets, there's so many lights. In fact, it's very interesting to watch behind the scenes of like big Hollywood productions.
Yeah.
And then you can see the huge amount of lighting.
Yeah.
Even outdoors.
Yep. Well, you got to compete with the sun for
yes, which is the ultimate brightest source. And so, right.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's a very good point. So as a last resort. So, and I think that's exactly right. That's the biggest difficulty, I think, when people are first learning this.
Well, the concern, there is a reason we are belaboring these concepts. They are so important,
right.
And they never go away.
Because I don't think there's any way we're going to be able to get through everything, considering it's 6:12 right now.
What we're going to do is wrap up in 3 minutes.
Well, yes.
But I feel like this was time well spent.
Yes,
because if you understand focus and exposure, and particularly exposure, it will serve you well for the rest of time in both your photography and your video work. My concern is I think a lot of times students that we work with, they're cranking up their ISO and they're not really even aware of what their shutter speed and f-stop values are.
Yes, and it's and I don't, and it's you think, it's like it's a struggle because it's like and I think, I can understand. When I was first learning this stuff, one day it just clicked, but it did take a little while until it clicked. But then one was like, oh. And actually, I was talking to another student who's in this class, actually.
Yeah.
And she said that she eventually got it. It like clicked, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So, and I was asking her, well, in the beginning, it was like, it just didn't click yet. But once it clicked for her, it did. Mm-hmm. And then it was like, I see the light now. I see the light. But, and I think that also she was saying that she began to understand that, there are limitations.
Yeah.
To the camera.
To the equipment itself.
And the equipment itself. Yeah. And you have to be aware of those limitations and really be aware of the amount of light you have, and you have enough light to do what you want to do. In
addition to our human frailties, we also have equipment limitations.
I think that for the exposure triangle, I think the key thing to understand is that you have to focus on one variable first, and everything else, all the other variables revolve around that, depending on what your artistic purposes are, or depending on what effect you would like to produce.
And what I hear you saying is you want to either focus on aperture or shutter speed, and then deal with the other one, and then change your ISO as necessary.
Well, yeah, so if depth of field is the most important thing in terms of how you want the photo to look, then that is the variable you are going to choose first, and everything else will revolve around that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
With the ultimate objective of balancing the amount of light. Not too much, not too little.
Well, to get the correct exposure.
To get the correct exposure.
Because the correct exposure for a dark room could be dark.
Yeah.
The correct exposure for a bright outdoor sunny day will be bright. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The correct exposure, I always say, is dependent on the lighting conditions.
Yeah.
The correct exposure for a night shot would be dark. Yeah. But, so it necessarily isn't underexposed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the correct exposure for a midday shot may be bright, but an underexposed shot at midday would be dark. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it just depends. Mm-hmm. But focusing on that one variable, because everything else revolves around that.
And if I could just add to that, it's also very important to be thinking about exposure specifically in terms of our subject. Because sometimes we set up a shot, and within the same frame, there's a wide variance in the amount of light.
Yes.
Sometimes the background has a ton of light.
That would be the dynamic range may be so great.
It could be a significant dynamic range. And again, this taps into the limitations of our equipment, but we do what we can with what we have, prioritizing our subject. And the subject depends on the shot. But usually it's the person in the shot, and we get them properly exposed, and maybe we try to change the amount of light if we can. We put more light on them so it evens it out, and then we bring everything down. We do what we can, but we expose for the subject.
Yes, exactly. Yes, we expose. Yes, we expose. That's very, very, very important. And I guess you know, the whole thing about clicking. I think it is very. It's like. I guess I should, you know, I just assume, well, why doesn't it get it? But in reality, I was thinking, like, for example, back when I was first learning CSS and HTML and JavaScript, and I remember I was taking your class, that summer class when I was a grad student, and I was utterly terrified. I didn't know, and I was like, I don't know what any of this is. I truly don't know.
Yeah.
You know? And then it took a year later, 2 years later, it was like, oh, that's what a tag is. So,
well, it takes a certain familiarity, I think, and a certain comfort with the concepts, and then it all just kind of comes together one day.
Yes, yes.
And so, bottom line is, we really want to encourage you to use your cameras, practice these techniques, just practice changing your aperture, change your f-stop value, and see what happens. Take 1 million photos.
1
million. 2 million if you need to.
Well, practice makes perfect. What is it, 3 hours? How many hours do they say? Practice, you need, practice. That absolutely is the only way. Only way.
You'll become more familiar, and just take a moment to think about, well, what are you doing? What happens when you slow down that shutter speed? What impact do you have on your footage? So go off, shoot a bunch of stuff, come back and look at it. We're going to be looking at photos, of course, this week and beginning to take photos, and we will continue to do so for the next few weeks. And then, as we build on these concepts, we're going to move into the wild and wacky world of video.
So, so now, I think we need to end, right?
I do believe we need to end.
Yeah. So, am I going to go to the outro animation, and then to black?
Bye for now.
Wait, it's all right. So outro and